A peace summit for Ukraine in Switzerland this weekend. What leaders hope it might be able to achieve.
I think we have to understand that this summit is not a place and was not originally envisaged as a platform for negotiated settlement of this war.
U.S. and NATO leaders at odds over Ukraine using Western weapons to hit targets in Russian territory.
If they were not able to do so, then we would actually ask them to try to defend themselves, uphold the right of self-defense, with one hand tied on their back.
And the UN's nuclear watchdog says Iran is expanding its nuclear capabilities. Today is Saturday, June 15th. Join us as we explore the issues in the news. Hello, I'm Lori London in Washington.
По сути, это было не что иное, как операция по принуждению украинского режима к миру.
Russian President Vladimir Putin promised Friday to, quote, immediately order a ceasefire in Ukraine and begin negotiations if Kyiv starts withdrawing troops from the 4 regions annexed by Moscow in 2022, and if Ukraine abandons plans to join NATO. Kyiv responded by calling Putin's proposal manipulative and absurd. U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin.
He is not in my view, not in a position to dictate to Ukraine what it must do to pursue peace. Putin can end this war today.
Putin's comments come as Switzerland is hosting a peace summit on Ukraine this weekend that will be attended by at least 90 countries and organizations, but not Moscow, as world leaders explore ways of ending the deadliest conflict in Europe since World War II. What does Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy hope to gain from the summit? And is there a likely outcome? We hear more from Lauren Anthony with Reuters.
Zelenskyy will use the event in the Swiss mountaintop resort of Bergenstock to build support for Ukraine's fight against Russia's invasion in 3 key areas: food security, nuclear safety, and the release of all prisoners and deportees. On the battlefield, the gathering comes at a difficult time for Ukraine. Russian troops, who now control around 18% of Ukrainian territory, are advancing in the east. With that and the entrenched differences between Russia and Ukraine, the summit will likely shy away from territorial issues. Instead, focusing on parts of Zelenskyy's plan that are broad enough to be palatable to most, if not all, participants.
Ending of this war.
Orisia Lutsevich, a Chatham House expert on both Ukraine and Russia.
I think we have to understand that this summit is not a place and was not originally envisaged as a platform for negotiated settlement of this war. Russia is not willing to negotiate at this point. It feels it has an upper hand on the battlefield. So it was an endeavor by Kyiv to actually unite the world in support for its war-ending strategy, to present it as a global issue and to count friends.
Around 90 states and organisations have confirmed their participation at the talks organised by Bern at Ukraine's behest. US Vice President Kamala Harris, French President Emmanuel Macron, and the leaders of Germany, Italy, Britain, Canada and Japan are among those set to attend the June 15th to 16th meeting. Russia isn't invited. Kyiv had hoped to take steps towards isolating Russia by winning over countries that have friendlier ties with Moscow. India, which has helped Moscow survive the shock of economic sanctions, is expected to send a delegation. And Turkey and Hungary, who maintain cordial ties with Moscow, will be represented. But the main thorn in Kyiv's side is China, a close ally of Russia's. Beijing said it would not attend the summit, describing the attendance of both warring sides as a prerequisite for any substantive peace conference. The question many will be asking is whether the Swiss summit will offer any tangible progress towards ending the war in Ukraine. Switzerland wants the talks to pave the way for a, quote, future peace process in which Russia takes part. Ukraine has said Moscow could be invited to a future summit on Kyiv's terms. Zelenskyy has acknowledged the challenge of maintaining international support as the war, now well into its 3rd year, grinds on. One political scientist told Reuters that while Russian President Vladimir Putin is still in power, it will be difficult to reach a peaceful solution. Russia has described the idea of a summit to which it is not invited as futile. Moscow frames its special military operation in Ukraine as part of a broader struggle with the West, which it says wants to bring Russia to its knees. Kiev and the West say this is nonsense, accusing Russia of waging an illegal war of conquest. Although Switzerland says Russia must be a part of the peace process, it said Moscow was not invited because it had no interest in attending. Byrne says the talks should define a roadmap on how to involve Russia and Ukraine in the future.
That was Reuters correspondent Lauren Anthony. The summit coincides with a meeting of leaders of the group of 7 leading industrialized nations as they wrapped up a 2-day annual summit in southern Italy. They renewed their pledge to support Ukraine's fight for freedom and its reconstruction for as long as it takes. Several announcements and agreements were shared by U.S. President Joe Biden on opening day.
We've taken 3 major steps at the G7 that collectively show Putin we cannot wait us out. He cannot divide us. And we'll be with Ukraine until they prevail.
Joining us to break it all down is Thomas Graham, a distinguished fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations.
And the most significant development from my standpoint was the signing of the bilateral security agreement between the United States and Ukraine, which pledges the United States to work with Ukraine on developing its military industrial sector and providing it the types of weaponry that it will need to continue to push back against the Russian assault, economic support, help in Ukraine making its transition into the Euro-Atlantic community, and putting sort of a 10-year timeline on this. I think that's probably the biggest development, and probably something that the Ukrainians were most pleased by, because it does provide something of a security guarantee that they've been looking for. Clearly far short of what they ultimately want, which is NATO membership and the Article 5 collective security agreement. But this is a good step in that direction. It's a step in that direction. Whether it ultimately leads to NATO membership is another question, but it provides them with a security arrangement for 10 years that continues the type of support and actually steps up the type of support that Ukraine is receiving from the United States and other Western countries at this point. So that at least will give them some confidence that they're going to have this type of support over the longer term, which is what they absolutely need at this point.
And so this 10-year defense agreement, will this hold if there is a different president in?
Yeah, it is an executive agreement. So technically, the next president could rip it up. Any subsequent president could rip it up. But the idea is to pull not only this agreement, but the ones that have been given by other countries, perhaps up to 30, into some sort of broader network of security guarantees, which would make it much more difficult for the United States to back out of it, even if the next president was less inclined to support Ukraine than President Biden is.
That's somewhat of a concern, given that former President Donald Trump, if he were to get reelected, there's some concern that he is not in favor of supporting Ukraine.
Obviously, he has had a bad relationship with Ukraine in the past. How that gets transformed into actual policy, were he to be reelected, I think is an open question at this point. There's a lot of concern, but this is hardly someone who has acted with great predictability when it comes to foreign policy over, even during his own presidency.
What about the agreement that was announced as sort of outlining a deal to provide $50 billion in loans for Ukraine using interest from Russian sovereign assets that have been frozen since Russia invaded Ukraine? Is this something that can actually make a difference? Because we've seen a lot of sanctions and other attempts to sort of stifle Russia's war efforts. How significant could this be, or is it not?
Well, I think the United States, the G7 partners, look at this as a way of providing a stream of money to Ukraine to support its war effort, to sustain it economically. I mean, the $50 billion is just shy of what the United States, and its supplemental, has decided it's going to provide Ukraine. Is about equivalent to what the European Union said it was going to provide Ukraine over the next 4 years. So it's a significant sum of money. And again, the Ukrainians will welcome that. The broader question you're asking about the sanctions that the United States levied, some of this, whether they were unilateral sanctions, but I'm sure they had conversations at the G7 summit as to how to coordinate to put pressure on the Russians. I've never been a big fan of sanctions. I don't think they work. I think the experience of the past couple of years has demonstrated that the sanctions haven't crippled Russia, that there are ways to work around this, and the Russians are very capable and ingenious when it comes to that. They have a lot of people on the outside that are prepared to support that. And so I think the sanctions that the United States has just levied will have a minimal impact on Russia's ability to continue to prosecute the war in Ukraine.
Turning back to NATO for a bit, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg told reporters this week that NATO will take a greater role in coordinating military aid for Kyiv, a greater role in coordinating arms supplies, etc. He said that this doesn't make NATO a party to the conflict, but it enhances support. Why do you think this decision was made?
Well, look, there has been concern about what a Trump presidency would mean. And the United States have been leading the effort to coordinate supply of munitions to Ukraine. Jens Stoltenberg had raised this issue somewhat earlier to give NATO a greater role in that, and that somewhat insulates the support for Ukraine from whatever a Trump administration might decide to do in that regard. So I imagine that continues to be what Stoltenberg has in mind.
And we have this peace summit coming up this weekend. Do you expect anything significant to come out of this?
No, not really. It has been scaled back a significant amount from what the Ukrainians initially hoped it would be. It's not going to be a summit that is focused on their 10-point peace plan. The agreement has been to scale it back to sort of 3 items in that peace plan that are sort of non-controversial, that deal with strategic stability, food, security, and return to children and POWs. It doesn't have the things that I think were most important to the Ukrainians, which call for the withdrawal of Russian troops from occupied territory in Ukraine, some movement on war crimes and other such matters. So it's much scaled back. It's not going to have a dramatic impact on the conflict, nor on the diplomacy surrounding the conflict.
And how concerned are you about the fact that Russian warships and nuclear weapons armed submarines are around Cuba?
No more concerned than I would be about the fact that Russian nuclear armed submarines sail off the coast of the United States. I don't know how many miles from our shore, but have been doing this continuously for many, many years. This is symbolic. It's something you can take pictures of, I imagine, done by the Russians to sort of demonstrate that, they have the power to strike the United States even with shorter range missiles than the ICBMs that clearly they have and could use in extremis. So this is a little bit of continuation of what Putin has been doing over the past several weeks in reminding the Western world, the United States in particular, that Russia does have nuclear weapons, that in some circumstances they might use them depending on how far the United States and our European allies go in supporting Ukraine. But I think from a military standpoint, I would imagine that the Pentagon is watching this closely, but this hasn't, in their mind, is nothing extraordinary.
Given all that we just talked about as far as world leaders, the United States, stepping up efforts to support Ukraine, looking at new ways to, hurt Russia as far as its war machine, and the tensions that are rising with Russia and the world and these warships. What is it going to take to turn down the temperature before this gets potentially much more dangerous? I
think a recognition that we are moving in the direction slowly of a direct military confrontation between Russia and the United States, with all that entails in terms of the possibility of nuclear use. We're not there yet, but we're moving in that direction. And at some point, I would hope that more sober minds in both Moscow and Washington would recognize that we have to get off this path in some fashion. So it's a slow-moving Cuban Missile Crisis. This is not going to play itself out over 14 days or 3 weeks, but it's been playing itself out over several months. I think there's at least several more months before we get to the point where we think the risk of a direct military confrontation is just too high and too real, and that it's time to take a step back and try to find a way to de-escalate.
Are you concerned?
Yes, I'm concerned. I'm concerned because this is occurring at a time when there are very few channels of communication between Moscow and Washington. We have less understanding of what the thinking is on the Russian side. They have less understanding of what our thinking is. And so the chances for miscalculation, misperception, increases, I think, significantly. And, we may stumble into a conflict that neither side really wants.
Thank you so much.
You're certainly welcome.
Thomas Graham, Distinguished Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Separately, in meetings earlier this week in Brussels, U.S. and NATO leaders were at odds over the extent to which Ukraine can use Western-provided weapons to hit military targets inside Russian territory. VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb has more.
As allies and partners debate how Ukraine should use Western-provided weapons, NATO's chief says Ukrainian forces have the right to strike military targets inside Russia. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg spoke at NATO headquarters.
If they were not able to do so, then we would actually ask them to try to defend themselves, uphold the right of self-defense with one hand tied on their back.
Stoltenberg welcomed the recent decision by some NATO members to loosen restrictions on the use of some Western weapons to strike inside Russia, especially after Russia began attacking Kharkiv from inside Russian territory. Washington recently gave Kyiv permission to use U.S.-provided weapons to strike military ground targets inside Russia, but with strict geographic limitations. Asked by VOA if Kyiv could use American weapons to hit military targets attacking Ukraine from deep inside Russian territory, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said no.
Our policy in using long-range strike capabilities to conduct strikes deep into Russia, that's not changed. But the ability to conduct counterfire in this close fight in the Kharkiv region is what this is all about. And the Ukrainians, my expectation is that they'll put that to good use.
Retired General Frank McKenzie, the former head of U.S. Central Command, tells VOA that's not enough. Should Ukrainians be able to fire anywhere inside Russia that's attacking Ukraine?
So, yes, but with certain limits. You need to be very careful not to attack Russian nuclear-capable sites, Russian nuclear command and control facilities, things like that. Aside from that, I would say we should give Ukraine some flexibility in where they strike inside Russia. You can't give them a sanctuary there. Russian command and control, conventional military command and control, Russian logistics, and other formations are really free of danger there. And I think that has significantly hurt the Ukrainian ability to respond to this latest offensive.
The addition of U.S.-made F-16 fighter jets will give Ukraine more ability to stop Russian glide bombs. The U.S. says the F-16s will be ready to arrive in Ukraine this summer. Carla Babb, VOA News, Brussels.
You're listening to Issues in the News. I'm Lori London. You're listening to Issues in the News. I'm Lori London. The UN Nuclear Agency, or IAEA, says Iran is expanding its nuclear capabilities in an apparent retaliation for the IAEA's Board of Governors censuring Tehran last week for its lack of cooperation with the agency. The IAEA notified Western media Thursday that its inspectors found Iran installing new cascades of advanced centrifuges for enriching uranium in atomic facilities in recent days. Back in February, Rafael Grossi, Director General of the IAEA, expressed concerns.
In a region, in the current circumstance, to have a country that it is presenting a face which is not entirely transparent when it comes to its nuclear activities. Of course, this increases dangers. There is loose talk about nuclear weapons, more and more, including in Iran.
The group of 7 leaders at the summit in Italy in a draft communique warned Iran on Friday about advancing its nuclear enrichment program activities, quote, that have no credible civilian justification. Iranian officials in recent weeks have hinted that Tehran may weaponize its nuclear program in response to its perceived external threats. My colleague Michael Lippin spoke with Behnam Ben Taleblu, a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, to get his perspective on the significance of Iran's latest nuclear steps.
While some might see Iran's installation of new centrifuges as redundant, the more centrifuges, particularly the more advanced centrifuges that Iran develops, tests, and brings online, the faster it can enrich uranium to greater rates. So these are all essentially helping to break down Iran's breakout time and working as a sword of Damocles against the West, showing that there's an expanding atomic infrastructure that Washington or other capitals can do very little about.
How different are these kinds of steps from what we've seen Iran do before?
Iran largely engages in horizontal or vertical escalation, either engages in some new qualitative activity, enriching to a new level or tunneling in a new location, or quantitative, amassing more centrifuges, producing more uranium that it saves in a different stockpile. So this is more of the same, but the problem is the same has already been dangerous. So it's the continuation of a very dangerous trend.
The U.S. State Department spokesman, Matthew Miller, reacted to the IAEA's findings about Iran's activities by saying that if Iran actually goes ahead with these plans, we will respond accordingly. So that sounds like a threat, but how much of a toughening of U.S. rhetoric does that represent in your view?
I don't necessarily see it as a toughening of U.S. rhetoric, but it was welcome to see, or hear, I should say, that the U.S. spokesperson did say that there would be a response. The question is, well, what kind of response? If the response is the kind of responses that we've seen over the past 3 or 3.5 years, these are the kind of pulled punches and half measures that have actually underwritten the expansion of the nuclear program and cemented the very unhelpful image in the minds of Iranian national security decision makers that the West, and in particular Washington, is irresolute and cannot afford a crisis, and therefore the regime will continue to expand its program.
Well, what do you think of the view that the Biden administration cannot actually afford a crisis with Iran on a nuclear issue when you have so much other chaos going on in the region, especially Iran's proxy war against Israel with the conflict in Gaza?
There's no doubt that regional matters are going to complicate the nuclear one, but the problem is this failed approach, particularly starting in April 2021, well before there was this Gaza war, led Iran to enrich uranium to 60% purity, which is a hop, skip, and a jump closer towards weapons grade, which is technically 90% purity. So unless this philosophy that is underwriting this failed policy is changed, you're going to see more of the same, and you're going to continue to see the regime take advantage of this situation. The problem is we've had a crisis on our hands for a few years. It's how we deal with it that matters.
When it comes to how the U.S. and its allies in Europe are going to deal with this, what do you think are the most likely steps? And when you talk about more of the same, are you talking about more sanctions?
It's likely going to be more sanctions, more diplomatic pressure, more economic pressure. The good news is that the Europeans have been moving much, much more strongly in this direction, not just on the Iran nuclear threat, but on the drone threat, the missile threat, and the human rights issue, hopefully on terrorism as well. But that remains to be seen. The more united and the tougher a transatlantic response, the less Tehran can play a salami tactic against either side of the Atlantic.
Well, let's talk a bit about this salami tactic. What exactly do you mean, and how will Iran respond to an increase of economic pressure from the West?
Well, oftentimes Iran will try to offset pressure from one side of the Atlantic by deepening ties with the other, or by trying to threaten the escalation or the continuation of a conflict with the other. Unfortunately, this was the case during part of the Bush administration, part of the Obama administration, and even part of the Trump administration. While it's, unfortunate now that there seems to be no overriding nuclear policy, the U.S. is kind of content to let the nuclear program be adrift. The pursuit is not even the fatally flawed JCPOA. Really, if there's a governing philosophy of the Biden administration towards Iran's nuclear program now, it's no crisis or no war, but the regime has been able to threaten war and expand a crisis to expand its nuclear program. So if past is precedent, you're going to see Tehran try to play both sides of the Atlantic across from each other again.
Well, Behnam Ben Taleblu, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, is joining us on the line from here in Washington, D.C. Thank you for talking to VOA.
Thank you, sir.
And that's all the time we have this week. On behalf of all of us here at VOA, thank you so much for listening. For more news throughout the week, listen to International Edition Monday through Friday, or visit us anytime at voanews.com. Join us next week for more issues in the news. Until then, I'm Lori London.